December 1980. Just outside a U.S. Air Force base in the English countryside, security patrolmen see strange lights descending into a nearby forest. Over the next 3 nights, dozens of military personnel, trained, trusted, sworn to accuracy, would witness something they couldn't explain. It would take 3 years for the world to find out. This is the Rendlesham Forest incident, sometimes called Britain's Roswell. Rendlesham Forest sits in Suffolk, England, about 8 miles east of Ipswich, nearly 6 square miles of pine plantation and heathland. In 1980, it bordered 2 military bases, RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge, both operated jointly with the United States Air Force. Around 3 a.m. on December 26, 1980, the morning after Christmas, a security patrol near the east gate of RAF Woodbridge spotted strange lights that appeared to descend into the forest. At first, the airmen assumed it was a downed aircraft. 3 patrolmen were given permission to investigate on foot. What they found in the trees would trigger one of the most documented UFO cases in history. The first night, the witnesses. The 3 men who entered the forest that morning were Sergeant Jim Penniston, Airman First Class John Burroughs, and Airman First Class Ed Cabansag. Cabansag stayed near the truck to relay radio communication, while Penniston and Burroughs went further in on foot. According to their later accounts, they described a glowing object in a small clearing, metallic in appearance, roughly triangular, about 2 to 3 meters across the base and 2 meters high. It illuminated the entire forest with a white light, with a pulsing red light on top and blue lights underneath. As they approached, the object appeared to maneuver through the trees and vanish. Nearby, animals on a farm reportedly went into a frenzy. Sergeant Penniston later made a striking claim, one made publicly only decades after the event, that he approached the object directly and saw strange symbols etched onto its surface, and that touching them somehow flooded his mind with a stream of binary code. This part of Penniston's story is far more controversial than the rest of the case, has no corroboration from the other men present, and only surfaced years later, worth knowing as you weigh how much credibility to give it. The next morning, investigators returned to the site and found 3 shallow, triangular impressions pressed into the ground, along with burn or abrasion marks on nearby trees, physical traces that, unlike the lights, could actually be measured and photographed. The second night, Colonel Halt. 2 nights later, on December 28th, word reached Deputy Base Commander Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt during an officers' dinner.
The UFO is back. I repeat, the UFO is back.
Halt assembled a team and returned to the forest, this time carrying a Geiger counter and a handheld tape recorder, running the entire time. On that recording, Halt can be heard describing a strange flashing light in the distance, and later 3 star-like objects in the night sky, 2 to the north, 1 to the south, moving with what he described as sharp, angular motion and shifting red, green, and blue lights. He said the object to the south hovered for 2 to 3 hours and, at times, beamed down a stream of light. Weeks later, on January 13, 1981, Halt wrote all of this up in an official memo to the UK Ministry of Defence, titled simply, Unexplained Lights. It was unclassified, just standard Air Force letterhead, but it was also the first time a senior military officer had put his name to a UFO account in writing. Halt's memo sat quietly in a file for nearly 3 years. The Ministry of Defense, by their own later admission, gave it only a cursory look. Nobody was interviewed, and no formal investigation followed. The leak and the media storm. So how did the world find out? In 1983, using the U.S. Freedom of Information Act, a researcher named Robert Todd requested and obtained a copy of Halt's memo. It began circulating among UFO researchers, and then, in October 1983, the British tabloid News of the World ran the headline that changed everything. UFO lands in Suffolk, and that's official. The story exploded. Books followed, including one by researcher Jenny Randles, who had been among the very first to report on the case. Documentaries followed too. The History Channel would later call it Britain's Roswell, in a special of that name, and it's been covered by the Sci-Fi Channel and multiple British broadcasters since. In 2005, the Forestry Commission even built a public walking trail through Rendlesham Forest, nicknamed the UFO Trail, complete with a sculpture marking the alleged landing site, turning the case into a permanent piece of local history. The skeptical explanation. Not everyone is convinced an alien craft was involved, and the skeptical case is detailed. Around the time of the first sighting, astronomers recorded an unusually bright meteor, known as a fireball, passing over southern England that same night. Fireballs are a well-known trigger for UFO reports. The flashing beam of light the serviceman described has been attributed to the Orfordness Lighthouse, one of the brightest in Britain at the time, and notably, when local police were called to the scene that first night, they reported seeing nothing unusual besides that lighthouse beam. As for Halt's star-like lights, skeptical investigator Brian Dunning, who studied the case in detail, concluded that each individual piece of evidence had a mundane explanation on its own, and that it was only when the events were strung together as one continuous story that they seemed extraordinary. But Colonel Halt never backed down. In a notarized affidavit filed decades later, in 2010, he stated on the record that he believed what he saw at close quarters was extraterrestrial in origin, and directly accused both the American and British governments of using, in his words, well-practiced methods of disinformation to bury the case. The psychic spies weigh in. But there's a stranger layer to this story, one most documentaries leave out entirely. For over 20 years, the U.S. military ran a real declassified program called Project Stargate, training remote viewers to psychically perceive distant places, objects, and events for intelligence purposes. And Rendlesham Forest was, at least twice, handed to them as a target. In July 1986, remote viewer Lynn Buchanan conducted a session for the Defense Intelligence Agency's Stargate unit. The target, unknown to him at the time, was Rendlesham Forest. The session notes were later declassified and released to the public. Buchanan has since spoken openly in interviews about what he claims to have picked up, not just a craft, but what he describes as direct impressions of the beings connected to it, which he has characterized in later interviews as human, but not from our time. Years later, in 2008, veteran remote viewer Joe McMoneagle, designated remote viewer number 1 in the original Stargate program, was given the same target in a double-blind session, meaning he had no idea what event he was viewing. His findings were later published in the book, Remote Viewing UFOs and the Visitors. McMoneagle has described his own impressions of the case in terms of something outside normal time, or time behaving differently around the event, language that echoes his broader, long-published views on remote viewing and time found in his book, The Ultimate Time Machine. Now, it's worth being direct about this part. Remote viewing itself is not accepted by mainstream science as a reliable method, and these sessions are, by nature, unverifiable. There's no way to independently confirm what either man actually perceived versus what they later interpreted or recalled. But the notable part isn't whether it's true. It's that two separate, independently trained military viewers, working years apart on a blind target, reportedly came back with strikingly similar conclusions. That whatever was in that forest wasn't extraterrestrial in the traditional sense, but human, just not from now. Make of that what you will. There's one more piece of this story that separates it from almost every other UFO case, because this isn't just about lights in the sky. It left a mark on a real body. In the years after Rendlesham, Airman John Burroughs' health began to break down. Starting in 2011, he suffered life-threatening episodes of atrial fibrillation, his heart quivering out of rhythm. By 2013, he needed emergency open-heart surgery. When surgeons opened him up, they found the posterior leaflet of his mitral valve shredded and disintegrating. His doctors later told him that if the surgery hadn't happened when it did, he would have died within days. A government-linked medical consultant concluded his injuries matched exposure to broadband, non-ionizing electromagnetic radiation, and a declassified UK government study, codenamed Project Condign, backed up the idea that this kind of radiation from unexplained aerial phenomena could cause exactly this sort of harm to the human body. After a legal fight that stretched 3 decades, the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs formally granted Borrough's full medical disability, officially recognizing his heart condition as an injury sustained in the line of duty. For decades, Borrough's case stood alone. Then, in 2024, a different whistleblower came forward with a strikingly similar story. Jake Barber, a former helicopter pilot, told journalist Ross Coulthart that he'd been involved in transporting recovered materials, including, he claims, an egg-shaped craft with no visible propulsion or seams. Barber said that after one particular mission, he and his entire team became seriously ill. Within weeks, he lost every hair on his body and the skin on his arms began peeling away. During that same interview, journalists drew a direct comparison between Barber's injuries and John Borrough's case, noting that Borrough remains one of the only other publicly documented individuals the U.S. government has ever compensated for this exact kind of harm. 2 men, decades apart, with no connection to each other, both left with radiation pattern injuries the government ultimately acknowledged in writing. Make of that what you will. Real military witnesses, an official government memo, a 3-year cover-up before the world even knew it happened, and a mystery that, over 40 years later, still doesn't have a clean, universally accepted answer. So, meteor and lighthouse, or something else entirely? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you want more real documented encounters like this one, subscribe, because we're just getting started.